The candle beside me burns low, its flame bending with every faint breath of night air that finds its way through the cracks of this old convent. I have sat here many nights in silence, whispering prayers, reading scripture, or simply listening to the echoes of my own heartbeat. But tonight is different. Tonight the silence feels heavier, as though it is pressing on my chest, demanding that I finally speak what I have kept hidden for so long. My story has been locked behind walls of duty, hymns, and a smile that convinced the world I was fine. Yet deep within me, a voice has grown louder with each passing year, insisting that truth must be told before time swallows it forever. What I am about to confess is not an easy memory. It is not something that belongs in polite conversation or in the cheerful stories exchanged over tea after Sunday Mass. No, what I carry belongs to the darker corners of human life. The kind of pain many choose to ignore because facing it would mean admitting that such cruelty exists behind closed doors. But it does, and it lived in my home, in the very marriage where I once believed love would protect me. Before I ever put on this habit, before I took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, I was simply a woman searching for belonging, yearning for affection, aching to build a life as a wife and perhaps a mother. I believed in fairy tales then, or at least in the idea that if I gave my heart freely and promised loyalty, I would receive the same in return. My trust was a gift, and I placed it in the wrong hands. The man I once called my husband spoke gently at first, his words like honey dripping onto a thirsty soul. He told me I was his treasure, his only reason to work so hard. He praised the way I prayed, the way I kept house, the way I tried to be gentle with everyone around me. And I believed him, because I wanted so much for those things to be true, but sweetness can sour. The very lips that once kissed me tenderly began to spit words that cut like broken glass. At first it was small, sharp comments about how I folded the laundry, how I set the table, how I spoke too softly when company visited. I told myself every marriage had arguments, every couple weathered storms. Yet his storms grew more violent with time. His hands, once open in affection, became fists against the table, against the walls, against the air itself when his temper flared. I thought I could calm him, that my patience and faith could soothe his rage. But rage, when it takes root, does not ask to be soothed. It demands to dominate. I will not give you graphic detail, for cruelty does not need to be painted in lurid colors to be believed. But I will tell you this: he broke me down, little by little, until I no longer recognized the woman staring back at me in the mirror. He told me no one would ever believe me if I spoke of what happened behind our doors. He told me I was weak, that my worth began and ended with him, and on nights when the weight of his anger pressed hardest upon me, I found myself trembling, pleading for it to stop, begging for mercy like a prisoner before an executioner. Even now, decades later, the memory of those pleas makes my voice tremble. For years, I saw them as proof of my weakness. I despised myself for lowering my dignity to begging. But age has taught me something I wish I had known then. Survival is not weakness. It is courage dressed in desperation. And though my words may have been broken, the fact that I am here to tell them proves that even in my lowest moment, God's hand was holding me still. My name is Sister Gloria Townsend, and I share this not because I seek pity, nor because I wish to stir scandal or judgment. I speak because silence nearly destroyed me once. Silence is what allowed the cruelty to continue unchecked, while I withered inside. By telling my story, I hope to pierce the loneliness of someone else who may be sitting in a darkened room tonight, whispering prayers that feel unanswered. The truth is, my journey did not end with the cruelty of a husband. It did not end with tears on a cold floor or with the feeling of being unseen. No, my story took a turn I never expected, a turn that even now I struggle to describe. After the breaking came the miracle. After the night I thought my soul had been extinguished. Light appeared in a way that could only be divine. If you have ever been trapped, if you have ever felt like your breath was stolen and your spirit crushed, then perhaps what I am about to share will reach you. Imagine a candle burning in a long hallway, its light small, its flame fragile, but steady enough to remind you that darkness cannot win completely. That candle was what I found, and that candle became my miracle. It is time to tell you how I fell, how I begged, and how I was lifted up again when I least expected it. This is not an easy story, but it is my truth, and it begins in a little town with a girl who thought love would be her salvation, only to discover that it would become the cross she had to carry. Long before the vows, long before the silence of convent walls became my home, there was a girl who believed that goodness was simple and that the world was safe. That girl was me. When I close my eyes, I can still see her clearly. Bare feet running across warm summer grass, hair caught in the breeze, laughter spilling freely without fear of who might be listening. I was raised in a small American town, where church bells marked the rhythm of our days, where neighbors waved from porches, and where the sound of hymns on Sunday seemed to promise that God Himself lived in every corner of our lives. My family was not wealthy, but we were steady. My mother hummed hymns while baking bread, her voice sweet as the smell of yeast rising in the oven. My father was a man of discipline, quiet but devoted, who bowed his head at every meal, even when food was scarce. We lived simply, but I believed we lived blessedly. Faith was not just in the prayers we recited. It was stitched into the fabric of our home, into the way my mother comforted us when we were sick, or the way my father took off his hat when passing the church. No matter how hurried his step, as a child, I dreamed the way most little girls do, with innocence, with colors too bright to fade. I imagined one day wearing a white dress of lace, walking down an aisle sprinkled with petals, the church filled with music. I dreamed of holding a child, my own flesh and blood, swaddled against my chest, trusting me entirely. I thought love would be my crown and marriage my castle. There was no shadow in those dreams, no warning of how fragile such hopes can be when placed in human hands. Even in school, when I studied scripture and learned about saints who endured suffering, I imagined their pain as something far away, belonging to another age. Martyrdom belonged to the history books. I thought my life would be gentler, because surely faith would shield me from suffering. How young and naive I was. It was during those years of youthful longing that I first saw him, the man who would one day become my husband. I was still very young, but already imagining the life ahead of me. He seemed to step right out of the pages of those dreams. Tall, confident, with a smile that melted into charm, he carried himself like someone meant to be noticed. When he looked at me, it felt as though the rest of the world blurred. He spoke kindly, asked questions about my family, and when he laughed, others joined in, as though joy followed him wherever he went. To the townsfolk, he was respectable, hard-working, ambitious. Mothers nudged their daughters toward him at church socials, whispering about what a fine husband he would make. And I, foolish with innocence, believed those whispers, believed his attention was a blessing. I thought God had chosen him for me, that this was the answer to prayers I had not yet fully spoken aloud. At first, there were no shadows. He brought flowers he said reminded him of my smile. He carried baskets for my mother at the market. He held doors open with a flourish, calling me his angel. I floated on those gestures, convinced that love was unfolding exactly as it was meant to. My friends teased me, saying my cheeks turned crimson whenever he entered the room. My heart beat faster at the sound of his voice, and I told myself this must be what the poets and psalmists had written about. This fire, this certainty. But even in those early days, I remember small moments that unsettled me. Once, as I laughed with a cousin at a church gathering, I noticed his eyes narrow ever so slightly. Later he asked me who that boy was, why I smiled so widely at him. I brushed it off, thinking jealousy was simply proof of love. Another time, when I lingered too long talking with friends after Mass, he scolded me gently, saying a wife's attention should be for her husband alone. Again, I excused it as eagerness, as passion. I was too inexperienced to see the roots of control winding beneath the soil of his charm. Still, in those days, my heart overflowed with hope. I imagined the home we would build, the children who would fill its rooms with laughter, the holidays where family gathered around a table heavy with food. I thought of long walks on cool evenings, of whispered prayers before bed, of a love that would last a lifetime. It seemed the future was already written, and I was simply walking toward it with open arms. When he asked me to marry him, I felt no hesitation. The ring was modest, but the promise felt enormous. Standing in the church with his hand in mine, I believed I was stepping into the life God had always intended for me. I believed that happiness would be mine, because I had chosen with faith and purity of heart. I could not yet imagine the storm that lay ahead. Looking back now, I see that innocence is both a gift and a danger. It allows the soul to hope without restraint, but it also blinds the eyes to shadows. I had no experience with deceit, no lessons in manipulation, no shield against charm that concealed something darker. I wanted so much to believe in love that I ignored the warnings whispered by my own spirit. But at that moment, walking down the aisle in a dress I had stitched with my own hands, the congregation smiling, my father's arm steady at my side, I was radiant with belief. I thought I was entering into a sacred covenant that would protect me, not destroy me. The bells rang, the choir sang, and I whispered vows that felt eternal. Little did I know that those vows would become chains, and that my crown of dreams would one day feel like a crown of thorns. Hope carried me to that altar. Hope blinded me to the storm. And it was hope that I would cling to, even as everything around me began to unravel. In the days that followed our wedding, life unfolded like the petals of a rose, bright on the outside, fragrant in the morning light, yet hiding thorns, sharp enough to draw blood. The world looked at us as if we were the perfect pair. Neighbors smiled when they saw us walk hand in hand down the main street. My friends teased that I had been swept into a fairy tale, and for a while, I believed them. I believed that the promises exchanged at the altar were still strong and true. At first, he kept up the same charm that had won me. He brought me flowers from the market when he returned from work. He told me I looked beautiful even when I wore plain dresses, flour on my apron from baking. He pulled out chairs for me at the dinner table, touched my cheek as if I were something fragile to be cherished. In those early days, I clung to every gesture, convinced they were proof of the life I had always dreamed of. But illusions have a way of cracking when tested by time. Slowly, I began to notice that his compliments often came with hidden barbs. "You look beautiful," he would say, "but perhaps you should not wear that color. It makes you look too noticeable." Or, "I love how you bake bread, but why did you burn the crust this time? A good wife never lets such things happen." At first I brushed these remarks aside, telling myself all marriages had small criticisms. Yet with each passing week, the compliments grew fewer, the criticisms sharper. I remember one afternoon not long after our wedding. We had been invited to supper with a family friend. I laughed freely during the conversation, sharing stories from my childhood. On the walk home, his hand tightened around mine like iron. "You laughed too loudly," he whispered, his tone smooth but his eyes hard. "People will think you are silly. A wife should be composed, not giddy." His words struck me like a slap, though his hand never moved. I apologized, though I did not know what for, and for the first time I felt a shadow fall over my heart. The control grew in small increments, so subtle that I often doubted myself. He began asking where I was going whenever I stepped out of the house, even if it was only to the market. If I lingered too long speaking with a neighbor, his questions later would be sharp and suspicious. "Why did you stand so close to him? What were you talking about for so long?" he would demand. I tried to reassure him, explaining with patience that there was nothing inappropriate. But reassurance was never enough. Suspicion was a fire that grew with every explanation, not a flame that could be extinguished. Yet even as these shadows gathered, he knew how to cover them with light when others were watching. At church, he bowed his head piously, holding my hand with what looked like tenderness. With friends, he praised me as a faithful wife. In public, he played the role of protector, opening doors, carrying parcels, speaking kindly. People admired him, and that admiration became its own kind of prison. If I ever doubted him aloud, who would believe me? He had convinced the world he was a good man. Still, I clung to hope. I told myself that love required endurance, that patience would soften his temper. I prayed nightly, asking God to bless our marriage, to give me the strength to be a good wife, to bring peace where tension was creeping in. Some nights as he slept, I knelt beside the bed, tears falling onto folded hands, whispering desperate prayers into the silence. I thought if I loved harder, prayed longer, endured quietly, the man I had once seen in him would return. But the man I had fallen for was not truly there. That charm had been a mask, and the mask was slipping. I began to notice the coldness in his eyes when no one else was around, the way his smile faded into something calculated the moment the door closed. He began to raise his voice more often, slamming doors or striking the table when something displeased him. Each time he apologized afterward, bringing flowers or speaking with regret, promising it would not happen again. For a while I clung to those apologies like lifelines. I told myself they meant he still loved me. But apologies without change are only chains dressed as ribbons. I remember one Sunday evening vividly. We had returned from church, and I was humming a hymn while setting the table for supper. He stopped in the doorway, watching me with an expression I could not read. "You sing too much," he said finally. "It makes you seem childish. People will not take you seriously if you always hum like that." My hands froze over the plates. Singing had always been my comfort, my way of lifting my soul when words failed me. Now even that small joy was tainted. I forced a smile, but inside I felt something collapse. Looking back now, I realize how carefully he was reshaping me, slowly removing the colors of who I was, painting me in shades of silence and fear. But at the time, I still believed I could fix things. I believed the weight of marriage vows required me to endure, to trust that love would conquer the shadows. I thought patience was the remedy. What I did not understand was that patience cannot heal a wound that is being deepened each day. The illusion lasted longer than it should have because I wanted so badly for it to be real. I wanted to believe in the man who had once called me his angel, who had promised me forever. But even angels can be caged, and my cage was closing in. I did not yet know the full darkness that awaited me. I only knew that something precious was slipping away, replaced by a fear I could not name. And though I still smiled for others, still bowed my head in prayer beside him at Mass, a small voice inside me whispered that love was not supposed to feel like this. That voice, faint and trembling, would one day become the roar of survival. But in those days, I silenced it, convincing myself that every shadow was only a passing cloud. I would learn soon enough that the clouds were not passing. They were gathering into a storm that would break me until I no longer knew who I was. Marriage, I had been told, was a sacred covenant. It was meant to mirror the union between Christ and His Church, an exchange of love, sacrifice, and mutual care. In the first months of my own marriage, I clung to that vision with desperate devotion. But as time passed, shadows crept into the spaces between us, and I began to sense that the covenant I had entered was not a bond of protection, but a slow unraveling of my soul. At first, it was the way his voice sharpened when no one else could hear. A simple question, "Why is supper not ready?" delivered with a tone that carried both accusation and contempt. Or the way he sighed heavily if I spoke too long about something that mattered to me, as though my words were little more than buzzing in his ears. He did not strike me, not then, but his words left bruises invisible to the eye. They clung to me through the night, replaying in my thoughts until even in prayer I could hear them echoing. One evening stands sharp in my memory. I had prepared stew, careful to season it as he liked, but the bread was slightly overbaked. He set the crust on his plate, tapped it with his fork, and looked at me with narrowed eyes. "Do you think this is good enough for me?" he asked, his tone quiet but filled with venom. My hands trembled as I tried to explain that the fire had flared too hot. He leaned closer, his words a hiss. "A wife who cannot even bake bread properly is no wife at all." I lowered my eyes, ashamed, though a part of me wanted to cry out that mistakes in bread did not measure the worth of a human soul. But fear held my tongue still. Gradually, I learned to move about the house as though I were invisible. I measured every word, every gesture. If I laughed too freely, his eyes hardened. If I prayed too long at night, he muttered that my faith was only for show. Even the way I walked seemed to draw criticism. Too quick, too slow, too loud on the floorboards. My life became a maze of invisible rules, and no matter how carefully I tried to follow them, I always seemed to fail. And yet, to the outside world, he remained the image of a respectable man. At church, he carried the hymnal for me, his hand on my back, as though guiding me with affection. Neighbors praised his hard work and his devotion. Some even said I was lucky to have a husband so attentive. Each time I heard those words, a knot tightened inside me. How could I tell them that the attentiveness they admired was, in truth, a chain binding me tighter? In those days, I often sought refuge in prayer. I would kneel beside the bed long after he had fallen asleep, whispering psalms with tears running silently down my face. I prayed for him that God would soften his heart. I prayed for myself that I might find strength to endure. But most of all, I prayed for light. Just a sliver of light to pierce the shadows that seemed to thicken with each passing week. There were times, too, when he softened just enough to confuse me. After a harsh word or a slammed door, he would come back with flowers or an embrace. "Forgive me," he would say. "You know how hard I work, how tired I am. I do not mean to be cruel." And I, starved for kindness, would accept his apology, convincing myself that the man I had once fallen in love with was still there beneath the anger. But apologies without change are like rain that wets the ground, yet leaves the roots still parched. His remorse never lasted, and soon the cycle began again. One night, after a particularly bitter quarrel over nothing more than how I greeted a neighbor, I locked myself in the small spare room. I pushed a chair against the door, my heart racing, my hands shaking. I sat there in the dark with my rosary clutched tightly, whispering Hail Marys until my voice gave out. I felt like a hunted creature, cornered in my own home. When morning came, I opened the door to find him waiting calmly with breakfast on the table, as if the storm of the night before had never happened. That was the cruelty of it, the unpredictability, the shifting ground beneath my feet. I never knew which version of him would greet me, the charming husband or the silent tyrant. It was during those months that I began to feel a change deep within myself. My laughter grew rare, my appetite faint. I wore plain, shapeless dresses to draw less attention. I lowered my eyes when spoken to, afraid that even the spark of defiance might provoke him. Friends asked if I was well, and I smiled weakly, telling them I was simply tired. Tiredness was a shield, an excuse that kept them from asking too many questions. In truth, I was exhausted, but not from chores or sleepless nights. I was exhausted from living each day in fear of what might set him off. Looking back, I realize that these were the first true shadows of the storm to come. They were warnings etched into my spirit, signs that I was not safe, that what I had mistaken for love was becoming a prison. But at the time, I told myself this was simply the burden of marriage, the sacrifice every wife must bear. I thought if I prayed harder, submitted more, smiled longer, the shadows would retreat. Instead, they grew thicker, wrapping around me like a cloak until I could no longer remember the light. I did not yet know how deep the darkness would become. I only knew that the girl who once danced barefoot in summer grass was vanishing, replaced by a woman who tiptoed through her own home, afraid of the sound of her own voice. There is a silence that comforts the soul, the hush of a chapel at dawn, the quiet of candlelight prayers, the stillness after the final hymn. But there is another silence, a darker one, and that was the silence I lived in during those years of marriage. It was the silence of fear, of words swallowed before they could rise, of pain hidden behind a forced smile. That silence became my prison. At first I thought I was still free. I believed if I just tried harder, if I spoke more gently, if I prepared meals with greater care, if I moved about the house exactly as he expected, then the storms would pass. But storms have a way of finding their own fuel, and my husband seemed to carry the thunder inside him. Even when there was no reason, no spark, he found ways to unleash it. It began with words, sharp and cutting. "You are worthless. No one would want you but me. If you ever left, you would have nothing." Those words became chains, wrapping around my heart until I could hardly breathe. I told myself not to believe them, but when you hear a lie often enough, it begins to sound like truth. Soon I could no longer remember the sound of my own laughter. I avoided mirrors because the face that stared back at me seemed hollow, as if the girl I once was had slipped away. Then came the control. He dictated how I dressed, what I ate, when I could leave the house. If I spoke to a neighbor too long, I would face his cold interrogation later. If I lingered after Mass, he accused me of drawing attention. He began to check the pantry, counting what food had been used, as though I might be guilty of some hidden betrayal. The home that should have been a sanctuary became a place where every corner held a threat, every sound a warning. And yet to the outside world, he wore the mask of a devoted husband. He held my hand in public, he bowed his head at church, he praised me to friends. People admired him, and their admiration sealed my lips. Who would believe me if I told the truth? I pictured their faces, the doubt in their eyes, the whispers behind my back. She must be exaggerating. He is such a good man. That fear kept me silent, and silence fed the prison walls higher. I began to wither. Food lost its taste, and I ate only enough to keep standing. My dresses grew loose, my skin pale. At night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, counting the hours until dawn, knowing the day ahead held only more careful steps, more words measured to avoid his wrath. My prayers turned desperate, no longer filled with thanksgiving, but with pleas for deliverance. "Lord, please change him. Please make him gentle again. Please give me the strength to endure." But heaven seemed silent too, and that silence nearly crushed me. There were moments when I thought of running. I imagined slipping out the door at night, carrying nothing but the clothes on my back, vanishing into the darkness. But each time the thought arose, his voice echoed in my mind. "No one will believe you. You are nothing without me. If you leave, you will crawl back on your knees." And I believed him. Fear is a cunning jailer. It does not need locked doors when it convinces you that escape is impossible. The worst moment came on a night when his anger boiled without warning. I will not describe the details, for they are too painful and do not need to be spoken to be understood. But I will tell you this. That night, I fell to the floor, my body trembling, my voice raw from pleading. I begged for mercy, not from God, but from the man who had once promised to love me. I clutched at his sleeve, whispering for him to stop, promising anything if only he would relent. That was the moment I broke. I remember lying there afterward, the floor cold against my cheek, my breath shallow. A part of me wondered if this was what death felt like, not the final silence of the grave, but the slow death of dignity, the extinguishing of a soul. I wanted to disappear, to dissolve into the floorboards so that I would no longer feel. But even in that brokenness, something inside me refused to vanish. A single spark remained, faint but alive. I cannot explain it except to say that God does not abandon his children even when they believe themselves abandoned. In the days that followed, I moved through the house like a ghost. My eyes were swollen, my steps unsteady. He acted as though nothing had happened, humming softly as he read the newspaper, complimenting the meal I prepared. His indifference was its own cruelty, as though my suffering were invisible, as though my begging had never reached his ears. But inside me, something had shifted. The silence I carried no longer felt like mere survival. It felt like suffocation. I began to realize that if I did not find a way out, if I did not cry out to someone, anyone, then the silence would not only smother me, it would bury me alive. Yet fear still held me captive, whispering that I had no one, that no one would believe me, that I was too weak to stand. And so I lingered in that prison, torn between despair and a fragile ember of hope. That ember would one day blaze into a miracle, but at that time I could not see it. All I could see were walls closing tighter each day. All I could hear was silence, pressing in until I could barely remember the sound of my own voice. The night I finally broke did not arrive with thunder or shouting. It came like winter slipping under a door, a slow cold that settled in my bones until even breathing felt heavy. After the night I begged for mercy, I moved through the days as if underwater, careful and quiet, measuring each step so as not to disturb the danger sleeping inside my own house. I ate little. I slept less. My prayers were thin threads that seemed to fade before they reached heaven. That evening, the kitchen light flickered. Soap clung to my hands. An ache sat in my chest like a stone that weighed far more than its size. The edges of the room softened, as though the walls leaned a little. I reached for the table and caught only air. When awareness returned, the floor was cold against my cheek and the house was hushed in a way that felt hostile. I tried to call out, but my voice cracked like dry wood. One thought rose through the fog with a steadiness that frightened me. If I stayed, the silence would finish what cruelty had begun. I cannot recount how I left the house. I remember a stubborn door, a neighbor's startled face bending over me, the rattle of wheels, and a ceiling of white lights sliding past as if the sky itself were being carried away in strips. Hands lifted me. Voices floated at the edges of sense. Someone asked my name. I answered in a whisper and felt it break in the middle. A nurse pressed a cool cloth to my forehead and told me to hold on. It felt like the last thing I could do. Hospitals have their own weather. The air hums with soft shoes and rolling carts. Distant voices mingle with the breath of machines. I drifted in and out of that sound as if carried by a tide that would not decide whether to claim me or return me to shore. Sometimes the world came back in a bright flash, then faded. I heard a doctor say the word critical. I heard another voice ask careful questions I could not yet answer. I closed my eyes and folded into myself like a letter no one should read. A priest came. I knew him by the small cross at his collar before I could make out his face. He spoke as though the soul could bruise under loudness. He prayed first for comfort and then for courage. I wanted to confess everything, every hidden fear and secret shame, but the words sat like stones on my tongue. He held my hand and said that God could hear what the mouth could not speak. I cried without sound, and for the first time in a very long while, I felt I was not completely alone. The body keeps its own record of sorrow. Mine wrote in pulses and fevers. I woke to nurses counting breaths, to a needle finding a vein, to the hiss of oxygen that tasted faintly of metal. A doctor leaned over me and explained that my body was exhausted and my heart had been under strain. He said the word survival once, and then again, as if he needed me to see the thin line on which I stood. He asked if I felt safe at home. Fear still ruled my tongue like a tyrant, and my silence answered for me. Time loosened its knots. I measured it not by clocks, but by the way light gathered and faded on the wall. I thought of the girl I once was, barefoot in summer, singing without shame. I thought of the woman I had become, small as a shadow, careful with every breath. I thought of vows spoken in a church of stained glass and hope, and how those vows had turned to cords around my wrists. A thought rose like rebellion. If I died that night, the last thing I would have known was begging on a kitchen floor. Something inside me refused that ending. Lying there, I prayed a prayer I had never dared to speak so plainly. I told God that if He wanted me still, He would have to come find me in that bed. I said I had no strength left to climb toward the light. I did not ask for thunder or spectacle. I asked for a small mercy, a way out, a hand to hold, a door I could walk through without collapsing. It happened quietly. No blaze of fire, no shattering vision. Sometime in the deep hours, when the ward settled into its slow breathing, and even the machines seemed to whisper, a stillness entered the room that was not emptiness. Peace slid over me like warm water. It did not erase the pain. It did not rewind the years. But it anchored me. The fear that had stood at the foot of my bed like a sentinel stepped back. I drew a breath that reached the bottom of my lungs and did not splinter. I felt a presence that was not mine, patient and near, as steady as a hand set gently on my shoulder. Across the hall, a tiny chapel glowed. Through the open door, I could see the small red lamp that keeps vigil beside the tabernacle, a flame no larger than a thumbnail. It held a whole world of steadiness. I closed my eyes and let that steadiness pour into my chest. No words sounded in the room, yet I understood what they would have said. You do not have to go back. With that awareness came a new fear. If I did not return, where would I go? How would I live? What would I say to those who believed my marriage was holy and whole? The questions rattled like coins in an empty jar, but the peace did not leave. It waited like a chair pulled out for me at a table I had been too afraid to approach. I realized that courage is sometimes nothing more than a decision made in a quiet room. Enough. Morning brought the priest again. A nurse guided him to my bedside. He looked into my eyes as if searching for a shoreline, and then smiled in a way that made no demands. He did not ask for proof. He did not press for explanations. He said there were safe places where I could heal, that the church kept doors open for those who needed shelter, and that there were people who would not require me to prove my pain before they offered help. My throat ached with relief. I nodded, and that single nod felt like the first step onto solid ground. The doctor returned and spoke of rest. He said I would need time to grow strong, and perhaps counsel, so that my voice could learn to trust itself again. He asked once more if I felt safe at home. I held his gaze and answered the truth. The word no sounded small and fierce at the same time, like a sparrow that had learned to fly. That day did not end my suffering. It did not untie the knots with a single pull, but it turned the wheel of my life by one quiet degree, and even a single degree can change a horizon. The night had taught me something I could not unlearn. Mercy sometimes arrives not as a trumpet, but as a gentle hand turning a ship toward land. By dusk I knew two things. I could not return to the house that had swallowed my voice, and I would not be walking away alone. Somewhere just ahead waited an open door, and with it the faces of people ready to help me find my name again. When people speak of miracles, they often imagine thunder splitting the sky, voices of angels echoing across the heavens, or a sudden healing that defies reason. My miracle was nothing like that. It did not roar. It whispered. It unfolded quietly in the dim corners of a hospital ward, in the soft compassion of strangers, in a peace that slipped into my heart when I least expected it. The morning after I told the doctor I was not safe at home, a change seemed to stir in the air around me. Nurses came by more often, not only to check my pulse or adjust the IV, but to place a gentle hand on my arm, to look me in the eyes as though I mattered. For so long, I had lived as if I were invisible, my feelings dismissed, my voice disregarded. Now every small kindness felt like sunlight touching skin that had known only cold. Later that day, the priest returned. He sat beside my bed without hurry, as though time itself bowed to patience. "You have carried a heavy cross," he said softly. His words trembled something loose inside me, for no one had ever named my suffering so plainly. I tried to answer, but my voice faltered. He did not push. Instead, he spoke of a God who sees what is hidden, who counts every tear, who bends close to those the world has silenced. In that moment, I realized my prayers, though faint, had not gone unheard. The chapel down the hall became my refuge. When I was strong enough to walk, a nurse guided me there one afternoon. The space was small, simple wooden pews, a crucifix above the altar, a single lamp glowing red. Yet stepping inside felt like stepping out of time. I knelt slowly, my knees weak, my heart unsteady. And then it happened. The quiet pressed close, but it was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of presence, the kind that does not demand, does not accuse, but simply surrounds you like a cloak. Tears came freely, not from despair this time, but from release. I whispered, "Lord, I cannot go back," and for the first time I felt that he was answering, "Then you will not." The miracle was not that my suffering vanished. It was that strength I did not know I still had began to rise in me. For so long I had believed I was powerless, that my husband's control was absolute, that escape was impossible. But as I knelt in that chapel, I sensed a hand beneath me, unseen but steady, lifting me to my feet. Hope flickered, fragile but alive, and hope is the seed from which freedom grows. It was not only faith that carried me forward, but also the compassion of those placed in my path. The priest arranged for me to meet a woman who worked with the church, helping those in dangerous marriages. She came to my bedside, her eyes filled with something I had almost forgotten existed: belief. She did not ask me to prove my story. She did not question whether I had exaggerated. She simply said, "You are not alone anymore." Those words struck deeper than any wound because they wrapped around the most hidden ache of my soul, the ache of loneliness. Day by day, plans began to form. Quiet conversations between the priest, the woman, and the hospital staff painted a path toward safety. They spoke of places where I could stay, where doors locked to protect rather than to confine. They spoke of people who would shield me if he came searching. Each promise felt like a brick laid on the bridge away from the life that had nearly ended me. Still, fear lingered. At night, I dreamed of him standing in the doorway, eyes burning, voice commanding me to return. I woke drenched in sweat, my heart racing, half convinced I was already back in that house. But each time the nurses reassured me, the priest prayed with me, and the woman reminded me of the plan. Slowly, fear loosened its grip. The greatest moment of clarity came one evening when I looked into the small mirror by my bed. For months I had avoided my own reflection. The face I saw there was thin, pale, marked by exhaustion. Yet in my eyes I caught something I had not seen in years. A spark, faint but undeniable. I realized then that my husband had not destroyed me completely. The part of me that still believed in love, in dignity, in God's mercy had survived. And if it had survived, then perhaps it could grow again. That realization was the miracle. It was not a single instant, but a slow dawning, like light spreading across a dark horizon. The miracle was that I had not been abandoned, that strangers had stepped in with kindness, that my prayers had reached the ear of heaven after all. The miracle was the courage to say, "I will not return." When the day finally came for me to leave the hospital, I trembled, not with fear this time, but with awe. The woman met me at the door, her car waiting outside. The priest blessed me, tracing the sign of the cross on my forehead, reminding me that God Himself walked with me. As I stepped into that car, I felt the air of freedom for the first time in years. My heart pounded, not from terror, but from the dizzying truth that I was leaving the house of torment behind forever. The road ahead was uncertain. I had no clear picture of what my future would hold, no promise that the path would be easy, but I carried something I had not carried in a very long time: hope. The kind of hope that steadies trembling hands, that whispers in the night, that opens doors long thought sealed shut. That was my miracle. Not a flash of divine thunder, but the quiet certainty that God had lifted me from the ashes of despair and set my feet on the first stones of freedom. And once my feet touched that path, I knew I would never walk back. The morning I left the hospital, the sky was gray, heavy with clouds that looked ready to burst. I remember thinking it suited the moment, uncertain, weighty, full of both threat and promise. The woman who had been helping me opened the car door and smiled gently. "You are safe now," she said. I wanted to believe her, but the echo of His voice still rang in my ears. Safe was a word I had forgotten how to trust. As we drove away, every street corner felt dangerous. My eyes darted to each car that passed, each figure on the sidewalk, convinced that at any moment He would appear, demanding my return. My heart thudded against my ribs, and my hands trembled in my lap. But mile by mile, the distance grew between me and the house that had caged me. With each passing block, I breathed a little deeper, as though the air itself was slowly loosening its grip around my throat. We arrived at a small house tucked behind trees, simple and unremarkable to anyone passing by. To me, it looked like a fortress. Inside, I was greeted by other women, faces etched with different kinds of sorrow, yet marked by the same quiet resilience. No one asked for details. No one pressed me to relive what I had endured. Their eyes told me they already understood. For the first time in years, I felt I had stepped into a place where my silence would not be judged, but respected. Those first nights in the shelter were strange. The bed was soft, the room quiet, yet I found sleep elusive. I would wake at every sound, convinced the door would burst open. Once I startled so violently at a creak in the hallway that another woman sat with me until I calmed. She told me her own story in fragments, not to frighten me, but to remind me that survival was possible. Her words were a lifeline. The priest visited, carrying with him the gentle weight of Scripture. He reminded me that God does not delight in suffering, that marriage vows are not meant to be chains. Freedom is not a sin, he told me. Those words cracked something in me. For so long I had believed that leaving would make me a failure in God's eyes, that endurance was the only proof of faith. Now I was beginning to see that endurance can sometimes mean finding the courage to walk away. Of course, the fear did not vanish overnight. I jumped when the phone rang, when a car slowed outside, when a man's voice carried down the street. The shelter staff reassured me that precautions were in place, that I would not be forced back. Still, fear is not rational. It lingers like smoke after a fire, long after the flames are gone. But alongside the fear, something else began to grow, an unfamiliar sense of possibility. One afternoon, I ventured outside into the yard behind the shelter. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine. For the first time in what felt like years, I stood with my face lifted to the sky and let the breeze touch me without permission. I realized how small my world had become under His control, how even air, light, and space had felt rationed. Now, with nothing more than the open sky above me, I felt a taste of freedom. tears slid down my cheeks, not from sadness this time, but from the overwhelming relief of being unbound. Slowly, I began to rebuild the pieces of myself he had tried to erase. I ate meals without being criticized. I spoke words without fear of them being twisted. I laughed, hesitantly at first, then louder, without glancing over my shoulder to see if it angered him. Each small act felt like rebellion, but also like resurrection. The woman I thought had died was stirring again, fragile but alive. The shelter connected me with counseling, and those sessions became another form of rescue. Speaking my truth aloud was terrifying, but each time I did, the power of the past loosened its hold. My counselor reminded me that shame did not belong to me. It belonged to the one who inflicted harm. Those words were like balm on an old wound, teaching me that my story, though scarred, was not something to hide in darkness. The church also became a refuge in new ways. I attended Mass quietly, sitting in the back pew, unsure if I belonged anymore. But as the choir sang and the prayers rose, I felt a stirring in my soul. God had not abandoned me, even when I had thought myself abandoned. His presence had waited patiently, and now I felt him drawing me near again. Perhaps the greatest rescue came not from priests or counselors, but from the community of women who surrounded me. They carried their own stories of brokenness, yet in their laughter, their shared meals, and their gentle acceptance, I found a family. They showed me that survival was not only possible, but could be shared, that our scars could knit together into strength. One evening, as we sat around a worn kitchen table sharing tea, I realized something profound. For the first time in years, I was not afraid to go to bed. I was not afraid of the door opening suddenly, of footsteps heavy on the floorboards, of words that would strip me down to nothing. That night I fell asleep and dreamed not of fear, but of possibility. Rescue does not happen in one moment. It unfolds piece by piece. It is found in safe houses and kind eyes, in whispered prayers and steady hands, in meals shared with strangers who become sisters. My escape was not a single door flung open. It was a series of steps, each one leading me farther from despair and closer to hope. And though I did not know it yet, that path of rescue would one day lead me here, to this habit, to these walls of prayer, to a life given not in chains, but in service. The woman who once begged for mercy was slowly learning to lift her head again. The shelter gave me a roof, food, and safety, but what it truly gave me was time. Time to breathe, time to listen, time to remember who I was before fear hollowed me out. At first I moved carefully, as if one wrong step might send me back into the shadows. But gradually, with each sunrise that came without threat, I began to believe freedom was not a dream. It was real. In those early months, healing came in fragments. My counselor urged me to speak my story aloud, and though my voice often trembled, I forced the words out one by one. With every confession, the grip of silence loosened. I learned that naming pain does not make it larger, it makes it bearable. She reminded me that what had happened was not my fault, that endurance was not failure, and that survival itself was proof of strength. Those truths settled slowly into my heart like seeds waiting for spring. Yet even as the wounds began to knit, I struggled with questions that haunted me. What now? Who was I without the identity of wife, without the chains that had once defined my days? My hands were restless, my heart uncertain. I feared the emptiness of a future with no shape. But God, in His patient mercy, does not waste even the shattered pieces of a life. The priest who had visited me in the hospital continued to guide me. One afternoon, he asked if I might help with a parish outreach program, teaching children their catechism lessons. I hesitated, unsure if I had anything left to offer. But when I stood before those little ones, their eager faces turned toward me, I felt something stir inside. As I spoke of God's love and mercy, I heard the words echoing back into my own soul, reminding me that His love and mercy were meant for me too. Teaching became a balm. Their laughter, their questions, their small voices reciting prayers gave me reason to rise each morning. For the first time in years, I felt useful, needed, alive. My days began to take on new rhythm: counseling sessions, shelter responsibilities, parish teaching. Slowly, the broken woman who had once begged for mercy was being reshaped into someone who could stand, speak, and even smile without fear. But it was not only the children who drew me forward. It was the quiet hours in the chapel, kneeling before the crucifix. There, in the silence that once suffocated me, I found a different silence, one that held me rather than crushed me. I poured out my grief, my anger, my questions, and in return I felt not condemnation but an endless patience. Night after night I felt the stirrings of something I had not dared to consider, a calling. At first I pushed it away. How could someone as broken as I was ever serve God in such a way? But the thought persisted. Each time I closed my eyes in prayer, I felt it gently pressing in. You are mine still. You always were. The idea of religious life frightened me. It felt impossible, a path reserved for those who had been pure and whole, not for a woman scarred by pain. And yet the sisters I met during parish work never looked at me with pity. They welcomed me with warmth, asked nothing of my past, only encouraged the hope they saw returning in my eyes. One of them said, "God does his best work with broken vessels. They carry his light more brightly." That sentence lodged deep in my heart. The more I prayed, the more the call deepened. I realized that my suffering, though cruel, had carved space in me. A space wide enough to hold the pain of others, to understand, to listen. Perhaps my story was not a mark of shame, but a gift that could be offered in service. When I finally spoke to the priest about it, he smiled gently. "Do not let fear make the decision," he said. "If God is calling, he will provide the strength." His words echoed long after I left his office, and so, with trembling courage, I began the process. It was not simple. There were forms, interviews, long conversations with spiritual directors. Each step felt both terrifying and freeing. I feared rejection, yet at every turn I was met not with doubt, but with welcome. The day I entered the convent as a postulant, I carried little with me, a few clothes, a small Bible, and the weight of years that had nearly destroyed me. Yet as I crossed the threshold, I felt something lift. The walls of the convent were not like the walls of my old house. These walls sheltered, protected, embraced. Learning the rhythm of religious life was not easy. Rising before dawn for prayer, long hours of work and study, silence kept in discipline rather than fear. It was all new. But in each act of surrender, I found freedom. I was no longer living for the whims of a man's temper. I was living for God, for service, for love that asked nothing but honesty. In time, I took my vows. Poverty, chastity, obedience, words that might sound like loss to some, but to me, they were wings. Poverty freed me from fear of possession. Chastity freed me from chains disguised as love. Obedience freed me from the tyranny of cruelty, placing me instead under the gentle guidance of a God who is love itself. As I stood in the chapel that day, dressed in the habit of my new life, I felt the scars on my soul. But they no longer burned. They had become part of me, reminders of where I had been and of the God who had carried me out of the darkness. The broken girl was gone. In her place stood a woman reborn, not flawless, not unmarked, but whole in a way I had never thought possible. That was how I became Sister Gloria Townsend. Not because I was perfect, but because God's mercy does not require perfection. It only requires a heart willing to say yes. I sit now in a room much like the one where this story began, though the silence around me has changed. Once it was the silence of fear pressing against my chest like a stone. Today, it is the silence of peace, filled with the faint rustle of prayer books and the soft hum of wind through the chapel windows. My life has become a rhythm of service and stillness, of prayer and work, of small joys that are no longer stolen but freely given. It has been many years since the night I begged for mercy, many years since I collapsed on that kitchen floor, convinced my life had ended. Sometimes when memory rises, it comes with a sting sharp enough to take my breath. The scars remain, etched deep into the fabric of who I am. But they no longer control me. They are no longer chains. They are reminders. Reminders that I survived, reminders that I was lifted when I could no longer stand on my own. When people meet me now, they see Sister Gloria Townsend, a nun who prays, teaches, and serves. They see the habit, the rosary beads at my side, the calm face of a woman who has walked long years with God. What they cannot see is the journey behind it, the years of silence, the collapse, the miracle that unfolded in whispers. Yet I carry it with me, not as shame but as testimony. For every scar tells of a wound that healed, and every healed wound tells of a God who never abandons. My work now often brings me into contact with women who carry their own hidden sorrows. Some sit before me with downcast eyes, ashamed to speak their truth. Others tremble, their voices cracking under the weight of memories they wish they could bury. I listen, and when they ask how I can understand, I smile gently. I tell them that pain has many shapes, but survival has one truth. It is possible. And I know it is possible because I have lived it. There are moments when I walk through the convent garden, sunlight warming the roses, and I think of the girl I once was. Barefoot in the summer grass, eyes bright with innocence, heart eager for love. She was shattered, yes, but she was not lost. I carry her still, and I whisper to her across time, "We made it. We are safe now." I also think of the woman who knelt on cold floors, who whispered prayers through swollen lips, who thought God had turned his face away. To her, too, I whisper, "You were never alone. Even in the silence, he was there. And now you are free." The legacy of my life is not in the suffering, but in what followed. The miracle was not only that I escaped, not only that I found shelter, but that from those ashes came a calling to serve, to comfort, to remind others that no night lasts forever. That is the gift God placed in my hands, and I intend to carry it until my last breath. People sometimes ask me if I have forgiven the man who broke me. Forgiveness is a difficult word, heavy with misunderstanding. To forgive does not mean to excuse. It does not mean to forget. What it means for me is choosing not to let his cruelty define the rest of my life. Forgiveness, in my heart, has become a form of freedom. I released him into God's hands, and in doing so, I released myself from the chains of hatred. I no longer measure my worth by the lies he spoke. I no longer fear the sound of his voice. My worth is measured by the one who calls me daughter, the one who lifted me from the floor and gave me breath when I thought I had none left. That truth sustains me, even on days when the memories return uninvited. As I close this story, I want to speak not only of my past, but of your present, whoever you are. If you are listening with tears in your eyes, if you are whispering prayers that feel unanswered, hear me now. You are not alone. Silence may surround you, but silence does not mean abandonment. Hope may seem small, but even the smallest flame can outlast the deepest dark. I am living proof. The miracle was not only in what God did for me, but in what he can do for anyone who dares to cling to even a shred of faith. My journey is only one voice among many, but if it can light even a single candle in someone else's hallway of despair, then the telling has been worth it. I began this story with the words, "He broke me until I begged for mercy." But I will not end there. I will end with this. God rebuilt me until I learned to sing again. And the song he placed in my heart is one of peace, of service, of hope. If you take anything from my confession, let it be this. The miracle was not only surviving, it was becoming whole again. And if it happened for me, it can happen for you.